Money is the tool for most action in the world. If you don't have any money, it's like walking over a tightrope over a pit of alligators every single day.
What do Marines, monastic life, and money management have in common? Douglas Lynam. He shares his wild path from taking a vow of poverty to managing 250 million in assets.
Like, the stress is unrelenting if you're living paycheck to paycheck. If you're faced with the choice between putting food on the table or gas in your car, like, these are the kind of stressors that many people face on a daily basis.
In this episode, we unpack how money trauma shapes your choices, the link between stress and financial health, and how the Enneagram can help you tame your inner money monsters. Doug breaks down real steps to heal your relationship with money and why financial freedom starts with self-awareness.
Your Enneagram type tells you where you're going to struggle in your financial life. And then once you have financial security, how do you use that wealth, that power that you have, which is tremendous?
Stick around, because it might change how you think about money forever. Doug, marine life, monastic life, and money. 3 different topics that you managed to bring them together.
It was a kind of a wild journey for me. I grew up in a somewhat affluent family where money was, for my childhood experience at least, it felt like it was weaponized. And so my brothers and I all kind of rebelled against that in very different ways. The first thing I did is I went off to the Marine Corps, which was as antithetical to how I was raised as you could. It was kind of an act of rebellion, but it was also my attempt to prove to my dad that I was a manly man who could do manly things and, try to win his approval. And it didn't really work very well. He didn't actually show up to my graduation from Marine Corps Officer Candidate School when I graduated at the top of my class. And so I was a little disheartened by that. And then I also had a bit of a spiritual awakening and realized that high explosives and unresolved anger issues were probably a bad combination. And so I then took a different track, and I figured, well, if I was going to leave the Marines, what would be a higher calling? What would give me the same esprit de corps, the same camaraderie, the same sense of mission and purpose I had in the Marines that maybe didn't involve, projecting my anger issues onto other people. And so I decided to go off and become a Benedictine monk. And I did that for 20 years, and I enjoyed it very much in many ways. But I also decided to take a vow of poverty because I figured that was another great way to really flabbergast my parents, which I was very successful at doing. Turns out my brothers and I, we all took a vow of poverty in different ways. My twin brother ran off and became a homesteader in upstate Vermont. And my older brother ran off to a grunge band in Seattle. And so we all kind of basically just walked away from the kind of capitalistic, materialistic world in our own unique and rebellious ways. But about 3 years into my 20-year journey as a monk, the monastery went bankrupt because it turns out if you live in a community where everybody hates money, then things don't tend to go very well. It causes some real problems. And so for a variety of reasons, the responsibility for pulling the community out of bankruptcy fell onto my shoulders, even though I was financially illiterate at the time. But I figured I couldn't do much of a worse job than where we were at, so I might as well give it a shot. And it took me about 3 years to really pull us through all that mess, and I did that successfully. And along the way, I learned how to manage money and realized I was pretty good at it. And so I did that. And then while I was in the monastery, the guests who would come visit us with all kinds of problems, they would ask me would say, "Would you pray for me?" And I'd be like, "Well, of course. But, making a budget might be more effective in solving some of your problems." So I realized that a lot of people's spiritual problems and just their problems in life in general are direct cause or have an indirect financial issue related to them. So, for example, if someone's really sick in the hospital, the illness is one issue, but then paying the bills is an additional stressor that falls onto families. So there was lots of these circumstances where people were in all kinds of financial hardship, and I would just offer my services pro bono. That was sort of my community service that I offered while I was in the monastery. And then over time, I realized it was something that I could bring to the world and be of more service. And maybe the monastery kind of got a little stale. 20 years was a long time. And I didn't feel like I was growing too much spiritually after a certain point. And so I decided to leave, and I became an investment advisor. And I became a partner at Longview Asset Management in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I did that very successfully for many years. And then I exited that business last year to become a full-time writer, speaker, and coach.
That's one of the most unique stories I ever heard, to be honest. Like going from Navy SEALs to monastic life for 20 years and learning in the most unexpected place how to manage money. And how did you do that?
I went to a local bookstore, and I grabbed every book on the shelf I could find on money management and just the basics of finance, and read every book I could get my hands on. And I had a really robust college education. I went to a funky school called St. John's College, which is the third oldest school in the country, and they have a unique program called the Great Books. It's called the Great Book School, and so you read the classics from the ancient Greeks up to the 20th century, all in chronological order, studying through the lens of math, science, language, and then sort of your philosophy, seminar, literature. And so it gave me a real booky academic training that served me well, that gave me the skills to really pick up any book and read it and learn on my own. And so that was a real gift I was given through my education. And I think that was a real wonderful way to have that sort of really robust liberal arts background, that in the classic sense of it, not in the modern sense of it. And it gave me the analytical ability to just pick up anything and learn it.
That's amazing. And especially because you did basically your apprentice in the monastery, and then you took it to the real world and help more people and impact more people. And you mentioned there are two words like stress and money. How related are they?
100%. So money is the tool for most action in the world. So if you don't have any money, it's like walking over a tightrope over a pit of alligators every single day. Like, the stress is unrelenting if you're living paycheck to paycheck. If you're faced with the choice between, say, putting food on the table or gas in your car, like, these are the kind of stressors that many people face on a daily basis. And if you can alleviate that stress, because that stress leads to a whole host of other problems that you really don't want. So we know from the research now that your socioeconomic status is the best predictor of mortality that we have, because poor people have higher rates of obesity, drug addiction, alcoholism, domestic violence, domestic abuse. Every sort of metric that you don't want increases as your income level goes down. And so when you can alleviate those stressors, then you find that people's lives improve significantly. And oftentimes their spiritual lives also improve, because now they have more time and energy and resources to focus on other people, because they aren't struggling day to day just to get their daily needs met. And so one of the great things I found about being a little bit wealthy is I now have the free time to manage my schedule how I want, live my life the way that I want. And it's a real gift I would like to give to as many people as possible.
What do you call a little more wealthy? Like, what's the limit that we can live comfortable? I know it might differ from person to person, but let's say where the level of stress coming from the lack of money or from lack of enough money, it's comfortable and we are not pressed by that.
Well, there's no set dollar amount. I mean, it's going to depend on where you live and, kind of what kind of your lifestyle that you want to live. But for me, I would just say it's the point where you're not grinding every day paycheck to paycheck, where you have a robust emergency savings and you have significant enough investments that, if a major financial shock comes your way, you're able to just navigate it with grace and dignity.
That's a good perspective, because a little bit of background. For example, when I grew up, I noticed my parents struggling a lot. Like you mentioned, like paycheck from paycheck, they were like writing down every single money that was coming in, was going out. And I felt that stress. I saw the fights and so on. And most of them, the source was money, not enough money. And they were working really hard. They tried to put both me and my brother through university and so on. And I'll be forever grateful for that. But indeed, I think as well, I get from there some sort of not that healthy relationship with money. Not to mention that in the country that I'm coming from, Romania, let's say the financial education is not really present in school. And if you're not going on an economic route or whatever. So I feel that in my relationship with money now, like how a normal human being like myself or others that are listening and they have a poor relationship with money, we're either spending too much or like avoiding spending, how we can manage this in a healthy way.
Well, I guess that kind of leads into my next book, which is Taming Your Money Monster, which is really exploring through the lens of this tool called the Enneagram, which some people may be familiar with and some not. And maybe I could kind of walk you through a little bit how that works. Because your Enneagram type is essentially, if you think of your personality, it has two components to it. It has a nature, which is your DNA and your genetic predisposition, and it has a nurture component. And so the Enneagram kind of explains the nurture part of your personality, which is how your ego defenses develop in childhood to help you navigate the biggest stressors in your environment. And it's necessary. It's important to have an ego. You need one to kind of drive around in the world. And the Enneagram really explains how that ego develops. And it explains kind of the lens through which you see reality. So there's 9 basic archetypal patterns of personality in the Enneagram, which I can explain in a bit. But then what I've done on top of that, I've layered what's called the attachment theory of money, which is based on the attachment theory of relationships, which some folks may or may not be familiar with, which says that in our intimate relationships, our romantic relationships, we can have a healthy attachment to people. But when we're unhealthy, we tend to develop either an anxious attachment or we develop an avoidant attachment style. So when we apply that to money, we can either be overly anxious and overly concerned about money, which would be sort of like an Ebenezer Scrooge mentality, or kind of like my parents were a little bit. They had their own money monsters where they were maybe a little too worried about it in a way that caused problems obviously for their family. And then there's the avoidant types, which was what I became, which is people who kind of push money away out of the fear or the shame or the anxiety that it produces for them. And so when we layer this attachment theory of money onto the 9 archetypal patterns of personality in the Enneagram, there's 18 unique money monsters that I explore in my new book, Taming Your Money Monster.
This will be very actionable in terms of turning theory into actual practice, how people can leverage this knowledge.
Okay. Let me sort of walk you through how the Enneagram works. I'll start from the very beginning and I'll go a little slow, and we won't get through all of it. We'll just get through a piece of it because it really is sort of the physics of consciousness. It's the rules by which a personality can develop. So you have to think of, I like to use car metaphors because I think they're accessible to people. And so if you think about cars, there's an infinite ways you can design a car. There's infinite variety of possibility, but there's certain models of cars. There's makes of cars and there's years of cars. And so you have a unique year, make, and model for your car, but there's general categories of cars, just like there's general categories of egos. And so like there could be family sedans, there could be SUVs, there could be sports cars. And so the Enneagram is like, what's the kind of the model of car you're driving? And then within each model, there's of course infinite variety inside of those. So think of it like a color wheel. And if you took a color wheel and divide it up into 9 quadrants, that would be kind of, each color would be maybe another way of thinking about what you're ending up to be sort of that, where you land on that color wheel, that infinite variety of possibilities. And so this is the question that really I've been wrestling with for many decades, which is how does consciousness form? How do we actually develop our personalities? And in my book, Taming Your Money Monster, I've really tried to ground it in childhood developmental psychology and neurobiology. And so let me just kind of walk you through how an ego might form. And you have to kind of do a bit of a thought experiment with me. And so it gets pretty technical pretty quick, but it's a lot of fun. I love this stuff. So if I'm going over your head, slow me down. So imagine what your consciousness was like when you were in the womb, like when consciousness first flickered on. What was that experience like? And so my sort of axiomatic assumption, so the starting point for the system, is that experience was one of unconscious unity, meaning you weren't aware of, you didn't have a fully formed sense of identity of self, of what's me and what's not me. And everything that you could experience, you were kind of in this oceanic bliss of oneness in the womb with your mother. And then you develop, and there can be neonatal trauma, which I kind of skip over because it's just too complicated. But at some point, eventually you get popped out of the womb and it's like, surprise, there's more to reality than just you. And so there's a physical umbilical cord that gets cut at birth, but immediately there's a psychological umbilical cord that forms between you and your caregivers. And so it bonds you very closely to your caregivers because they have to do most of the driving of your ego for the first several years of your life. And you slowly mature and slowly develop what we call an individuated sense of self. And that individuation, it happens slowly, but that psychological umbilical cord over time has to be cut. And we know from the neurobiology that positive emotions will only reinforce your connection to your caregivers. So that psychological umbilical cord can only be cut by negative emotions. And the 3 core negative emotions in all mammalian brains, and we know this from the work of the pioneering affective neuroscientist by the name of Jaak Panksepp. He found that in mice and then in all mammals, there's in the mid-limbic region of the brain, there's 3 core negative emotions that all other negative emotions are sort of a combination of. And so those 3 negative emotions are anger, sadness, and fear. So your psychological umbilical, your Enneagram type of your personality is primarily the nurture part of your personality is determined by which of those 3 negative emotions you experienced the most of in your childhood environment. Was it more anger? Was it more sadness or shame? Those are sort of interchangeable. Or was it fear? And so there's that. If you think of this color wheel of the Enneagram, it gives us these three quadrants of the anger, fear, and sadness. We call them the triads, these anger, fear, sadness triads. And then within each of those three triads, we can process that negative emotion in one of three ways. So we can either internalize it, which is giving ourselves an emotional wedgie. We can externalize it, which is sort of like having a food fight with the world, or we can have both. And so there's three ways to process each of those three negative emotions, and that gives us the 9 archetypal Enneagram patterns of personality, which I can then go into a little bit more depth. Does that track for you?
Yeah, it makes sense because indeed, and especially the thing that you mentioned, I dig a bit deep into this topic for particular other reason. And it's surprising how many things we carry with us from even before we're actually here in this world, just from the emotions our mom feel when is pregnant with us and so on. And all these things for me make perfect sense. But if you want to break it down a bit more, like you mentioned that every single one is split into other three and makes the nine points on the Enneagram. Which are those?
I want to share a slide deck with you. So now you can see here on the screen, here's the 9 different Enneagram types. So you can see we have these 3 triads that I talked about. We've got up here the anger triad. We have type 8, 9, and 1. Let me sort of walk you through this a little bit if that's okay. So that the cutting of the psychological umbilical cord is what I call your sacred wound. And so if your sacred wound was through anger, if you experience more anger and you externalize that anger, then what happens, we call that the type 8, which is often known as the challenger. I call them the Hummer of egos because they're sort of like the battering ram of ego personalities. They can run over just about anyone and anything. But the greatest fear of a type 8 is then in how their psychological umbilical cord is cut, it creates, we each have a unique greatest fear. And so a type 8, their greatest fear is being harmed or controlled. And so they tend to push against the boundaries of reality. They're always sort of challenging limitations or anything that might control them. So 2 good examples in history would be Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Donald Trump. They're both classic type 8s, where they just like to push against the status quo in any way that they can. So those are 2 really good examples because they want to control their environment because they don't want to be controlled by it. And I'm going to skip over to type 1 for a moment, because that will make more sense. Their psychological umbilical cord is then cut by anger. They internalize towards themselves, and that creates their greatest fear of being bad or defective or corrupt. They have this like really strong inner critic that's always like a drill sergeant telling them to shape up and do better. And so always trying to improve themselves or improve the people around them, which is why I call them the BMW of egos. They're very high maintenance. They're precision engineered, but they require a fair bit of maintenance. They can be very critical of themselves, and they can be very critical of others. And so they're sort of always trying to improve the world around them. A good friend of mine, Richard Rohr, is an example of that. He's always looking for ways to improve political or social structures in the world. And then in between them, if we have both an internalized and externalized anger, we get the type 9, which is often called the peacemaker. I call them the RV of egos because they often like to just kind of sit at the campground while the world passes them by. The type 9 have so much internalized and externalized anger that they never want to tap into it. They're afraid that if they ever really tap into that anger, it will rip them apart. So they want their environment around them as peaceful and as possible. So the problem with type 9s is they're very kind and very sweet, but because they tend to avoid conflict, problems can really build up around them because they fear the loss of wholeness that might result should their anger ever be tapped into, and it might rip them apart, kind of like this Incredible Hulk might come out and suddenly, And so they don't get angry very often, but when they do, they can be very intractable. They get very passive aggressive, or they can explode unexpectedly, if very rarely. So they don't want that loss of wholeness that might come about should that anger ever come forth. So that's why we call them the peacemaker. So let me stop with that triad and see if there's questions there, and then maybe we can move into the sadness triad.
And if someone is either of this, like either the improver, the peacemaker, or the challenger, let's take one, let's take the peacemaker, or maybe the challenger, because you give the example of Donald Trump, and since he's such a popular figure, a lot of people can relate probably with his behavior and so on. How we address that? Like if we identify that we externalize a lot of this anger and so on into fear of being harmed or controlled by others, and we're always pushing back and like trying to take control all the time, how we address it, especially in the relationship with money, because often that can backfire massively.
This is a really great question. It's a really deep one. So then beyond, this is just sort of the top layer of the Enneagram. To answer that question more fully, I would need to like look at the complete ego map for a type 8. And we could do that. We could walk through one example, maybe if that would be helpful. So let's just round this out, and then we'll just give you the surface level for all 9, and then we'll just go deep into one of them. So if we then look at the sadness triad, or often called the shame triad, we have the type 2, which is often called a helper. I call them the ambulance of egos, because they're always sort of running around helping other people. They're very kind, they're very sweet, but they have this externalized sadness, which means they feel sad or ashamed about how they think people perceive them. And that creates their greatest fear of being unlovable. So they're always kind of running around trying to win approval through acts of service. But there's sort of the problem with the type 2 is that those acts of service have a strings attached to them. It's conditional love. It's kind of it's a pay to play scheme they're kind of involved in with the world. In other words, I'm going to help you, but the reason I'm doing it is I want you to validate me and tell me how lovable and how kind and how wonderful I am. And so type 2s tend to run around helping other people, but have a hard time taking care of themselves. And so that can lead to all kinds of financial problems for the type 2. And then we have the type 4, we'll jump over there. They have this internalized sadness or shame. And that means they feel sadness or shame about how they perceive themselves. And what that creates is their greatest fear of not being unique or having a real identity. They don't really know their place in the world. And so the way they try to assuage that fear is they have this sort of knee-jerk reaction against conventionality. They're always rebelling against the status quo, and they're always trying to be unique and different, stand out in some special way to establish their individuality. And so that for them can create all kinds of financial problems because they tend to rebel against the conventionalities of like budgeting or bookkeeping or earning a living, or they tend to make great artists and creative thinkers and entrepreneurs, but sometimes they have their own unique money monsters, which we can explore that if you'd like. And then in between, if you have internalized and externalized sadness, that would be the type 3, often called the achiever. I call them the race car because they tend to be, running for racing to the finish line, but they often leaving their authentic selves in the dust, because this internalized sadness makes them, again, ashamed about how they perceive themselves and ashamed about how they think people perceive them. So that creates their greatest fear of being worthless. So they're always running for the next achievement, getting the gold star, getting the pat in the head, winning whatever race whatever they set their mind to, but it's really trying to assuage that inner sense of worthlessness. So they're trying to get validation through their achievements. And that can lead to all kinds of money problems for them, which maybe that would be a fun one to explore. Let me finish out that try and see if there's any questions you have on that.
It's interesting because I assume we can be in different traits. For example, I resonate a lot with the helper one, but I find characteristics from the achiever and as well, for example, from the peacemaker. So we, as individuals, we can have like different characteristics from different traits.
Absolutely. And that's another layer to this, which is there's a path of growth for each type, which means you start to look a little bit like a different type when you're growing in your sort of spiritual practice. And then there's a type that you fall back to when you're under stress. And this will make more sense when I walk through one particular type. So there likely to be 2 other types that you resonate very closely with, but one that is your sort of your daily driver, one where you go to in stress, and then one where you go to when you're at a more healthy expression of your type. So which one do you think resonates most with you in the day-to-day?
And trying to go through to see the others as well, and especially around fear. So we have there, for those that are not able to see but I highly recommend to look at it on YouTube, on the podcast, so you can see the visual because it's very well represented. So there is the internalized fear, which is fears being incompetent, and the externalized one, fears of being in pain, in privation. And the other one, it's both from internalized and externalized, fears being without support and guidance. So it's hard, like I kind of find things in every one of this, but I think my daily driver might be fears of being unlovable, so the helper. I think it's almost on par with fears of loss of worthiness. Kind of those 2.
I could give you some questions and quiz you on this a little bit, but the first question you want to ask yourself is, instead of trying to figure out your type, figure out first, in your darkest emotional moments, what emotion do you tend to feel more of? Is it more anger? Is it more sadness and shame? Or is it fear? Which of those emotions do you tend to experience more of? Sadness. Oh, okay. So that puts you in the sadness triad. So you're probably either 2, 3, or 4. And then it takes a little bit more work to dial it in more tightly from there. But if you're a 2, yeah, you're always trying to get people to like. So let's maybe walk through.
I think it's no need. Like, I am 90% sure that it's fear of being unlovable, because I am a people pleaser in my love life with my wife or family members or friends or clients or even people that I just met. I try to get into that position in which, yes, I'm worthy of your attention, whatever, and try to please people in different ways I can.
Okay, well, let's walk through the ego map for the type 2. This is a lot of information in one spot, but if you look over here on the left, this is the general map that I've created for how your ego develops for all types, which is, again, we're starting here at the bottom of this double cone. What we're looking at, for those who are listening, is imagine 2 traffic cones stuck end to end. And so you're creating this double cone. And at the bottom of the cone is where you're starting your journey in life, in, as we talked about earlier, in that state of unconscious unity. And then you move up the bottom of this double cone, and then your ego is growing, what we call the first half of life. And that's where you're establishing your independence. Instead of your journey, what I call it, the journey from thee, which is the divine, however you want to define that, from thee to me. And you're establishing your place as an independent individual in the universe. And your ego has to grow so you develop a sense of conscious separation. So you're moving from unconscious unity to conscious separation. And then there's this whole shadow structure that we'll go through for the map for type 2 of how that works. But then eventually, for all of our types, our ego gets so strong, it throws into what I call the dark night of the soul, meaning you've developed these ego defenses that then create a sense of separation from everyone and everything, including your sense of the divine in whatever tradition you want to work with. And it's in that sort of midlife crisis, or or there can be external trauma can come in that could throw us into the dark night of the soul. And that's where all of our money monsters really manifest at their peak as well. I'm drawing it as a linear model, but of course, life does not work as cleanly as this. It's not a linear process by any means. You can move up and down in this in a day, right? Or over the course of years or decades. So then eventually your ego has to break open, and through suffering, we learn compassion and forgiveness and acceptance. And we move into what I call the second half of life, which is your path to interdependence. So first half of life is establishing your independence. And the second half of life is learning your interdependence, or what I say, moving from me to we, to reach to the kind of the peak of spiritual awakening, which will be conscious unity, which is your being able to see yourself as an interconnected being in the crazy cosmic fabric of life. So that's the overall journey we're all taking. But then for the type 2, which we're looking at here, let me go back to the bottom of this double cone. And we'll start here at what I called your sacred wound, which we mentioned earlier. So now we're looking at the shadow structure for the type 2. And if you're a type 2, then your sacred wound is that externalized sadness or shame. And then we're moving up to the next step. It's sort of like a ladder we're moving up. And then the next thing is your greatest fear, which is, now I've changed the terminology in the Enneagram significantly. So for those who are watching, you'll see the traditional Enneagram terms in parentheses. If you're already familiar with the system, it'll help you follow along. If you don't know the Enneagram, you can ignore that. It won't help you. But I've changed the terminology to make it a little bit more linear and streamlined, so that the shadow structure I've developed mirrors the enlightenment structure, which is the top half of this double cone that we're discussing. So, and please interrupt me at any point if I'm going over your head here. I'm covering a lot of material very quickly. So that greatest fear of being unlovable as a type 2, or what I call the ambulance of egos, it creates then your greatest vice, and the greatest vice for a type 2 is pride. And what that means is type 2s take pride in what a lovable, kind, helpful, generous person they are. Type 2 is sort of like the person, there's that old parable or story of, it's better to teach a person to fish than to give them a fish every day. But oftentimes type 2s are the kind who would rather give someone a fish every day rather than teach them how to fish, because they want the stream of gratitude coming back to them constantly. They're feeding off of that affirmation and validation continually. So it's kind of a trap for them that they have to overcome. But your ego doesn't want to look at this. It doesn't want to see this. So it hides it. And so type 2s have what I call your primary ego addiction, which is flattery, meaning you're really good at telling other people how wonderful they are, or are being of service to others. It's like, I'm going to tell you how wonderful you are, so you'll tell me how wonderful I am. Right? It's the kind of basically, in a nutshell. It's a little more complicated than that, but it's basically how it works. And then when type 2s get stressed, so if they eventually, what happens is that they tend to overextend themselves at some point, Or what happens is they're giving a lot, but they're not getting back what they were expecting. They're not getting the validation or the help in return. They're really, I'll help you, but they're expecting, kind of the game they're playing is, I'll help you, but I expect you to turn around and help me in return. And if that loop doesn't connect in the way the two wants, they have a secondary ego addiction, which is vengeance, which is the primary ego addiction for a type 8. So they tend to look a bit more like a type 8 when they're in their stress point, or that secondary ego addiction. It's kind of like a teddy bear that suddenly grows claws and fangs. They can take sort of this vengeance and anger that comes out and frustration when they aren't getting back what they expect. But that secondary ego addiction, it's still riding off of the greatest vice or the pride of the two. So when you mix the greatest vice of pride that a two has with vengeance, what you get is revenge. And it sounds like it's a bad thing, but it's maladaptive to be sure, but it blocks the flattery. It's what keeps them from overextending themselves to the point where they break. So it's sort of a necessary release valve, essentially, for the two in order to keep them, because their pride and flattery is causing problems for them that more flattery isn't going to fix. Does that track for you?
Guys, like, I resonate so much with this, and I find myself in all this, and it's exactly the way I work. For example, when it comes to feeling or being unlovable, like when I find that I'm pride for everything that I share with others or I do for others and so on, and I expect that flattery back. And indeed, when that doesn't happen, then the vengeance comes. And now I'm super curious how you address this, because I see here above, like at the alignment structure. But for those that doesn't see and they resonate with this, how they can address this?
Let's maybe go into your money monsters for the type 2. This is where we're laying on top of the Enneagram, the attachment theory of money that we talked about earlier. So there's two ways that type 2s can have an unhealthy relationship with money. And I call them the bleeder, which is the avoidant type, or the bonder, which is the anxious type. We also have to keep in mind our financial life has multiple components to it. So again, this gets a little complicated, but there's really what I call the 4 pillars of finance. And the 4 pillars of finance are earning, saving, investing, and giving. So earning, saving, investing, and giving are the 4 pillars of finance. Now you could be anxious in one area of your financial life and avoidant in another. But let me explain these two money monsters for the type 2. So the avoidant type is what I call the bleeder, meaning they're bleeding out their money and their time and their talent and their treasure in service of others to the point where they aren't really taking care of themselves effectively. So they're kind of like a hemophiliac with a paper cut fetish. They're sort of bleeding out their resources and time too much in service to others. Or they can be what I call the bonder, which is that person, like we talked about earlier, who would rather give a person a fish every day with a side of tartar sauce and an "you're a wonderful, amazing person" note, rather than teach that person how to fish and give them the independence, because they want that gratitude coming back. So type 2s tend to be very good when we talk about the 4 pillars of finance. They tend to be good at the giving part, but they may have a harder time perhaps with the saving and investing part. Those are the two money monsters for the type 2. Does that track for you?
Yes, it's like you're describing me here.
Okay, great. All right, so now we've covered your shadow structure, and I'm basing this on kind of a Jungian understanding of the shadow. But now we've covered the bottom half of this double-coned Enneagram. Now we need to kind of break open your ego. We need to learn to let some of these unhealthy, and again, it sounds like we're being very negative, but all this is natural and healthy and part of the natural maturation process that we all need to go through. As long as we don't get stuck at any point, that's where things get problematic, because if we aren't growing, being lifelong learners, then we can kind of get stuck in the bottom in this first half of life and not move into the second half. That's the real tragedy for some people, is they don't realize there's a higher way of living. And so as you move up into the second half, into the enlightenment structure, the first thing we want to be mindful of is there's a spiritual trap door. I call it your faux virtue, and we all have one. And this virtue, it's good for every other type, but it might not be so good for you if you use it inappropriately, right? So the thing that type 2s need to watch out for, their faux virtue, is generosity. They can be too generous, because that generosity is feeding their flattery and feeding their pride. And so you have to be mindful that your generosity doesn't have all these emotional strings attached to it. But once you get past all that, we move into the next step up on this ladder, into your primary recovery virtue. And what that is for a type 2 is honesty. So honesty is about being honest about what your needs really are and being honest about what you really think and feel, because too often the flattery that twos engage in is hiding what they really think about other people or situations, because they're so busy people pleasing. They may have a hard time being honest about what they really want and need in a particular situation. And so then, because we've got two ego addictions, there's going to be two recovery virtues. And so the secondary, once they start practicing honesty and can be more grounded in their approach to other people, then there's a secondary recovery virtue. And for a type 2, that's joy, which is the primary recovery virtue for a type 4. So when 2s are healthy, they begin to look a little bit more like a type 4, which is the individualist, meaning they're more able to express their unique individuality. And they aren't so concerned. They're more grounded in who they are and finding an internalized sense of joy in life inside themselves that isn't based on other people's opinions or approval or reaction. And then we're getting to the end of this here for people who are listening. So then you have what I call your greatest virtue. And your greatest virtue is the combination of those two recovery virtues. And for a type 2, your greatest virtue is humility, which is the combination of honesty and joy. And that's the cure for the pride, which is your greatest vice down in your shadow structure. So when you're living in humility, it isn't about so much pushing your ego down, so much as just it's an accurate assessment of yourself, and you aren't so concerned about, you can live joyfully in the present moment in honesty. And then you have this humility that kind of cures all this need for approval from other people. And when you can do that, it creates then your greatest hope. And the greatest hope for a type 2 is to feel unconditionally loved. What you're really looking for is unconditional love. But the problem is that when you're in your shadow structure, all that flattery is conditional. I'll love you, but, right? I'll give you, I'll tell you great things about you. But again, it's got that, you're playing that weird psychological game. And so when you can be really humble, and then people can see you for who you really are, then you get loved for who you truly are. You could love yourself for who you truly are, independent of what other people think about you. And that really is where you reach to your highest. Then the last step of this, and we'll get to the money master, you have what I call your sacred gift. And each Enneagram type has a sacred gift to bring to the world. And for a type 2, it's divine love. And type 2 are really good at giving love, but the divine love is one that has cut the strings of conditionality to it, right? You're giving unconditionally, and you aren't expecting anything in return. If things come back to you, great, but it isn't, you've cut the cord on your generosity. And then you, more than any other type, can bring that unconditional love into the world. And that's the real sacred gift that type 2s have to offer. And that what leads us into your money master. So money master for a type 2, I call them the beloved, meaning they see the divine inside themselves first and foremost, but they also see the divine in everyone and everything around them, and are able to bring that love more fully into the world.
And if I'm someone that is listening right now and ask themselves, like, how this helped me in relationship with money, what do you answer?
Well, first of all, so if we go back to those 4 pillars of finance of earning, saving, investing, and giving. So now you're able to, and again, the book goes into this in great detail. So I would just encourage people to buy the book and read it, Taming Your Money Monster. So what it will do is will help you really get your financial life in order in all 4 areas of earning, saving, investing, and giving. Once you know where your spiritual problems are likely to be, and what your money monsters are, it explains sort of why. This whole book is trying to explore, why do we make, I don't want to say stupid, but why do we make unhealthy decisions with our money? And what is it psychologically that holds us back from really achieving financial abundance and security? Or even when we have financial abundance, like even my family, how do we make sure that when we have this tremendous amounts of resources, that we aren't using it in an unhealthy way to project our trauma onto other people? Because, a friend of mine, Richard Rohr, often says that, if we don't transform our pain, we inevitably transmit that pain, especially to those that we love most, and that includes our children. It's about having wealth that then can be used in love and service to a suffering world, so that you now have the tools to go out there and you have the resources to fix the crack in the world that you were born to repair. And so your Enneagram type tells you where you're going to struggle in your financial life. And then once you have financial security, how do you use that wealth, that power that you have, which is tremendous, in the healthiest possible expression of your Enneagram type?
This is powerful because at the end of the day, it all starts from awareness, and the Enneagram allows you to be aware of where exactly you sit and what are your basically strengths, weaknesses, and actually apply that in a healthy way in your relationship with money. And for anyone that is watching or listening us, when the book will come out?
July 8th. And you could pre-order on Amazon now.
Also, I'll put a link down below in the show notes. And if you may, I would like to conclude with, let's say, top 3 wisdom that you get out of monastic life that applies so well into managing money.
Well, I think the most important thing I learned is that I kind of went into monastic life thinking that, as St. Paul says, that the love of money is the root of all evil. And we misinterpret that quote badly because in the English language, we only have one word for love. And in Greek, there's 4 basic types, but there's a couple others as well. And to understand that it isn't so much money that's evil. Money's neutral. It's just a tool for action in the world. It's how we use it that matters. And so I think from my monastic time, I've come to more what Mark Twain would humorously say, that it's the lack of money that's the root of all evil. It's not having the resources that we need in order to take care of ourselves and those we love, and the stress that deprivation can put on us. The first takeaway then would be that money is neutral. It's a tool, and it's the primary tool we have for action in the world. And the more we are centered and grounded in ourselves spiritually, then the more wealth that we have, the more good that we can do in the world. And so what I found in the monastery is like, okay, I had all these dreams or hopes of how I want to serve the world, but I have no resources to put them into action. And so in a weird way, I feel like I'm being of more service outside the monastery than I was ever inside the monastery in some ways. And so that was probably the biggest takeaway for me from the monastic journey, is just trying to have a healthy mindset towards money. And then really it was understanding what were the psychological barriers inside myself that were preventing me from having a strong and robust financial life. And so I would just say, how important the second takeaway would be how important your psychological orientation towards money is in terms of having a healthy and happy life. And maybe for a third takeaway, I'm not coming with anything at the moment, but I'm sure it will hit me in a minute.
But those two are powerful because indeed it's such a misleading way to look at things, in the way that money are almost never the actual problem. It's our relationship with them, or how people are behaving when they have or they don't have money, rather than the money themselves, which are so helpful in many ways in our lives. Because if we have money, we can have access to better resources, better medical care, for example, or better health in general, not to mention all the other perks that comes with it, and being able to serve others and so on. And if we have a healthy relationship with money, doors just open and we never know where we can go from there. And I encourage everyone to take a moment to, if they took notes, to start to see where they are on the Enneagram, to buy your book and actually start reading it and notice where and how they can resonate with that and how they can apply in real life. Because just from what you share on the screen, it's unbelievable detail on how you address that from many perspectives. And I think the financial education that unfortunately a lot of people in this world lack, if that's addressed, the majority of the problems and stress that we face on a daily basis can be avoided.
Exactly right. And if people want, there is an Enneagram test that I like. I have a licensing, just full disclosure, I get a kickback when people take this test. It's called the IEQ9 Integrative Enneagram Test. And I can send you the link to that if you want to put that in the show notes as well. There's a lot of free tests out there the accuracy of the free test is about 50%, and the accuracy of the IVQ9 test is about 95%. So it's worth spending a couple extra bucks. If you can also read my book, of course, as well, but they go well together. To take this test, to find out what your type is, it'll save you some effort. And then also read the book, and that will go in more depth.
Indeed, and the way you position it, I think, and asking the right question, you can identify quite accurately. I resonate very fast with the ambulance, and it opened my mind in different ways of seeing things, and can't wait to dig deeper into this and investigate how I can improve my relationship with money. And I cannot thank you enough for sharing this wisdom with us today, Doug, and keep doing what you do, because you improve lives in unexpected ways.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Gabriel. It's been an honor to be on your show.